Hello, everyone. I'm Megan Klosterhouse, Head of Marketing for Rigor. And thank you all for joining us today for our webcast, Game Day Replay, 2018 Holiday Web Performance Trends and Lessons Learned. With me today is Francis Cordone, former Chief Performance Architect for BNY Mellon. Francis is a renowned leader in the digital and web performance space with over 20 years on both the client and vendor side of the house. Francis has dedicated his career to establishing results-oriented performance practices. Today, Francis brings his unique perspective and invaluable experience to Rigor by serving as the Chief Customer Officer, leading success teams, evangelizing digital experience best practices, and helping organizations move performance across the entire application development lifecycle. Also with me is Stephen Krauska, an avid speaker, author, thought leader on performance topics. Stephen has spent his entire career in pursuit of helping organizations achieve speed and performance nirvana. Today, as the Senior Solutions Architect for Rigor, Stephen leads the professional services team and consults with Fortune 1000 brands to help them improve their digital experiences, web performance, and drive key business results. For DevOps teams of big brand retailers, preparing for the holiday season is like training for the Super Bowl. And just like the Super Bowl, whether you play or simply spectate, we all wait in anticipation to see how the game plays out, revel in the successful runs, cringe at the unavoidable fumbles. For those of us in web performance and UX, this is where we see our efforts pay off as lifts in conversions, speed, and revenue growth, and where we identify the gaps we must tackle for next year. Today, Francis and Stephen will explore the successful plays and fumbles that impacted top online retailers for the holiday season and identify the key lessons we should carry with us into 2019. Just a few housekeeping items before we get started. This presentation is being recorded, so please know that within a day or so, we will email everyone who registered a link to download the slides and the recording. After the presentation, we may have time for a short Q&A session, so please submit your questions at any time during the presentation using the QA feature in your GoToWebinar panel. So with that, over to you, Francis.
Thank you very much, Megan. And just to make sure, Megan, are you advancing the slides? Okay, I didn't see that. So can you move to slide 3, please? So I have the honor to be here with everybody, sharing a lot of lessons learned, not just from the recent holiday season, but basically a lifetime of focusing in performance. And a lifelong career in performance teaches us a very important lesson, which is when it comes to something like Black Friday or Cyber Monday, the fumbles and what we see people fall into again and again and again is always the same. So we thought we would come here and share with all of you some of these lessons learned in the true spirit of working towards increasing the awareness of how important performance is and the specific things that we can learn from other brands and how they're managing their performance and their front end and user experience. One of the things about my career is that I have been in the performance industry for about 25 years, both in the vendor space, but more importantly, as a customer. As a customer at the Bank of New York Mellon, where performance was critical, where a few hours of outages could cost us several $100 million in penalty, as it happened a few times, and we really had to get everything together, internal teams as well as vendors, to work towards this common goal. And he taught me a lot. He taught me a lot about what performance really is. So today, together with Stephen Krauska, I have the honor of helping organizations not only monitor, not only deploy tools, but improve and keep performance at the right level to boost their revenue. Recently, about a few months ago, probably about a year ago, I just went out to the market and said, are there case studies that can prove that performance has an impact on the business, on the bottom line? And I found easily, within a couple of hours, 15 well-known case studies out there on the internet that prove that performance is indeed what matters the most for any initiative. And since then, we have replicated, working together, more than 35. So there's ample evidence out there. Now, what I put here in this slide is also to give the perception that if we have any other initiative, not per se a performance initiative, think about a cloud initiative, think about a front-end digital experience modernization initiative. The condition for those initiatives to make sense is that performance is maintained and managed. Whether the initiative is performance or not, performance is at the core of any initiative that's taking the sleep of the C-level people in any organization in the world today. So what are we going to do together? We're going to look, as a way to delve into this fascinating topic, we're going to look into some of the examples of what has been done, specifically in the last holiday season from the last week. We've been together, the three of us, Megan and Stephen and I, reviewing some of those results. And the truth is we found so much that represents many of the topics that we work with our customers and our organizations all the time. And we're very eager to share that. I'm really actually also happy to be here with Stephen Krauska. He is our performance ninja, and it is actually really humbling for me to be working with him. It's not just about high-level advice, but he's going to be sharing with us a lot of these detailed nuggets of information that we can put into action right away. Next slide. And with that said, we're going to give the audience a second to create some interactivity here. We'd love to hear from you and answer the first poll question. How long before the holidays did you start planning your performance initiatives? This, as you will see, will connect later with some of the lessons learned that we bring, not just from the holiday season, but from a long time working with organizations and some of the most common mistakes. We're giving it a minute while we collect those. Now, it is also true that some of the organizations we're dealing with may not actually have had any performance initiative. Think about this also in the way that performance had to be part of your initiative, even if it's not. If you had a new campaign for Black Friday, if you had any sort of attempt to attract more customers, did we manage performance with that? So interesting that it's actually not very bad, and I'm really pleased to see the market is evolving. So we have between 1 and 3 months, about half of the audience. That's actually really good news. We love the ones that are between 3 and 6, and we'll talk more about that. And really happy to know nobody started on the very same Thanksgiving day. So I do believe this corresponds to an increase of level of maturity in the market. And to be honest, that's really part of our efforts and what we're doing this webinar. This has been my lifelong pursuit, and we just want to create awareness of this. Next slide. So what we're going to do now is, I'm really excited to pass the torch to our very own Stephen Krauska. It's going to be super exciting. We've been digging into some of these results, and I'm really eager to share this with you. Get your popcorn ready, or if you're like me, get your chicken nuggets ready, because it's going to be a fun ride. And with that, take it away, Stephen.
Yeah, thank you, Francis. And thank you, Megan, for that introduction. So one of the things that I really want to talk to first is we're going to talk mainly about the high-level strategies behind these sorts of things and kind of some illustrative examples of what it looks like when these goes wrong. But essentially, what we're getting at here is really, again, the strategy, what it is and how it can either succeed or fail. And the first one that I want to talk about is something I call silver bullet thinking. So the idea that you can paint something on sort of after the fact, or that there's one product that you can buy that will handle all of the performance issues for you. And a common one of those things is a CDN, right? There are many CDNs in the world that will provide features that can optimize images for you, which is something, if anyone has read, the web performance books, optimizing images and reducing request counts and all those basic things that we think are so simple. Many CDNs promise to do them, but what can actually happen is if you put too much trust in that without actually measuring what the impact is, you end up honestly putting yourself in a worse position than had you not done anything at all. And so this is one example that I wanted to talk about. This is a client who had basically they were thinking they were moving to a CDN. They bought a service called Amazon Web Services. And Amazon Web Services obviously has a lot of things underneath the cover. One of them is the CDN, but some of it is just remote cloud storage. And the example that we have here is this customer based in the EU. Rather than deploying this particular, these core JavaScript files to that CDN to be served, they were incorrectly invoking them directly from that Amazon S3 bucket, as you can see there, rather than being a link that's their domain name to the JS file, et cetera, and it's being requested by Cloudflare to that particular place. They're requesting it directly from S3, and if you know your Amazon availability zones, that happens to be the one in Europe. So the example we have at the top is what these requests look like from their European users. One second, 800 milliseconds, not a bad number. But when you get further away, say like their clients in South America, then performance timings are up by 7x. And so that's just one example of a way that misapplying or misconfiguring or trusting a CDN to do something that it's not really doing can be detrimental. And another example that we have here is from a company that is again, the same major client. They had applied a different CDN for this particular page. And what we see here, looking carefully at the response headers, is a response code of not cached. And what this means is that even though they've deployed the web service, this particular resource may have just been applied directly to the page, or somehow had been routed outside of that CDN's resources and is not cached there, which is causing it to basically any benefit that would come from using the CDN is essentially lost in this case. And so really what we're talking about here is you have the false perception that just because you've moved to the cloud or because you've signed up for a CDN that everything is taken care of. Even the best laid plans there can go wrong if you're not trusting that. The other issue here is that these websites were probably not tested from a pre-production area that looks like that resembles their production area. One of the things we recommend is that your staging environment, as close as possible, match your production environment, which will enable you to catch something like the fact that it's served directly from a link to a resource in S3 as opposed to being routed through the CDN edge nodes. And the same thing goes for the other case. They may have been testing locally and said, oh, hey, we're here in the EU where our site is based, and we can see that the performance looks okay. Without looking globally at this, they missed the idea that the content being served from outside of their own area was much slower than that. So those are the two kind of key things we need to think about when it comes to rolling with the CDN. And the next big one I want to talk about is really looking at third-party resources and not really holding these accountable. So especially during the holidays, especially for e-commerce sites, third-party tags, resources, tracking pixels, all that sort of thing are crucial to some of the business goals, and that's completely understandable. But one of the things that you need to constantly be doing is being vigilant about where those resources appear in the page and how those resources are actually provided to you by the provider. So if we take a look at what happened with this example, there's two key things I want to call out about this. One, the blue line that you see highlighted by that red arrow, that's the browser DOM content loaded event. This is usually the event that signals the primary first-party content has been requested and parsed, and everything is ready to go to begin to paint the page. It shares some time, usually with a metric called first contentful paint, which is actually used by the Google SEO rankings to help determine where you rank compared to a competitor for SEO. Now, the reason I'm calling this out is as a general best practice, you want to prioritize all your first-party content before this line and defer any third-party towards afterwards. You see here, I'm calling out this resource, a JavaScript file from PayPal, which is being loaded and actually taking quite a bit a pretty decent chunk of time before that DOM load event, pushing that behavior out and as well, again, just loading in before the first-party content. So what we're getting at here is that the third-party content is being given priority over first-party content, which is something we never want to do when it comes to the early page results. But if we continue on, we learn something else about this by looking closely at it. This JavaScript file provided by PayPal, not only is it being served before other things that it should be, but it's over 14 times the HTTP archive's average size for a JavaScript file. One of the reasons why that's important to think about, as we'll see in a slide coming up, is modern browsers, the weight that parsing large JavaScript files has on modern browsers can delay the time to interactivity, which is another key metric for user experience. So the two things going on here is, one, we've prioritized third-party content above our own. Two, we really need to have this content served in a more optimal format, and perhaps if there is another candidate who you could use to do the same thing that PayPal was doing in this case, go with a different provider who's taking a little bit better care of their code here. Yeah, and then moving forward on to the next one, this is a really common thing that's been happening across sort of the performance industry or the web development industry that we've seen, is the popularity of single-page apps. And a really interesting example that we've come across was from a major clothing brand who moved to a single-page app framework, but did something that really indicates old thinking from the early days, I would say, of web performance. Anyone, again, who's familiar with the Steve Souders book on the kind of 10 commandments of web performance, one of them, which is still fundamentally correct, but can be misapplied, as you'll see in this case, is to reduce HTTP requests as much as possible. So if we go forward, we'll see that they did that, certainly. They combined all the JavaScript for this single-page app into this one file here. The other file I mentioned before with PayPal being 14 times HTTP archive size, we're looking at 154 times the average size. And what that does to the page is what you see above. Remember, I mentioned that parsing these large JavaScript files can be a significant penalty for the browser and for the end user. You can see there that that's an image of the page loading. The page is trying to parse that JavaScript file for, it goes well beyond 5 seconds if you can see the whole film strip, which we're not showing here. But in that film strip above, you see that the page doesn't even begin to paint any content at all for at least 4 seconds. And then we're well into 5 and 6 seconds before anything at all emerges from the page. And so really what they've done is they've taken what ordinarily would be a good practice and improve user experience by moving to this single-page app framework. They've lost a lot of that gain by combining everything into this one file that's 150 times the size that it ought to be. And we'll see a kind of counterexample to that in just a little bit in some of the things that we actually saw as success stories.
Thank you very much, Stephen. And one of the things I wanted to say about how you showed with us these fumbles is how these themes repeat themselves. And as I said earlier, Stephen and I have the honor of working with organizations on getting them faster. To be honest, that's our job, getting them faster and help them stay fast. And when we analyze the mistakes made, a lot of them go over these same themes that you have seen just now, which actually just happened last week in the holiday season. And it's evidence of two things. It's evidence, number one, that people don't have a way to ensure these guardrails. They may have awareness of these. Maybe a big portion of the audience is thinking, these are things I am aware of, or I know, or I read in the book. But do you have the guardrails to make sure that it doesn't happen? And do you have the guardrails to make sure it doesn't happen early enough so it's not too late? And consistently, no matter what organization we work with, the answer is most likely not, which is why there's so many performance fumbles when it comes to Black Friday and Cyber Monday. If we go to the next slide, please. We're going to now review what are some of the lessons learned in the positive. What are some of the things we can start doing, both at the high level, and also we'll share some examples from the specifics from the holiday season with Stephen. And basically, our attempt is to build up a set of best practices that we can start putting into practice. And for those of you listening, put it into practice right away. Start bringing these best practices into your processes, your organization, and your release cycle. The first one may seem obvious, but if I had a dime for every time a VP of digital experience of a big retail bank had said, look, let's go back to the basics, I don't even feel that I have a reliable way to determine when I have slowdowns, or worse, to predict that. It just doesn't happen. So obviously, we need to start monitoring, and we need to start doing it at the right level. Now, for those of you that, if I have any of my friends listening, they may get a chuckle out of this, but I love to say that common sense is the most uncommon of the senses. So when we work with organizations and we go over these very basic pieces of advice, believe it or not, more often than not, it's not there. We have to start from the basics. And the basics says we start monitoring. Now, if you go to the next slide, we start building on that. Monitoring, but not just any monitoring. The first thing we need to ensure is, are we tracking the right metrics? Now, this is evolving constantly. We can't be stuck in the metrics that were preferred a couple years ago, or maybe perhaps half a year ago. The reason for this is, if you have been in the front-end performance space for a while, you may be aware that there's been an ongoing debate for a long time on what are the right metrics to reflect user experience. Now, guess what? Google indexes the web. So if Google comes out and says, as they did last July, well, you know what? We're going to start from a ranking standpoint, we're going to start using first contentful paint to rank websites. Well, that is a direct impact to most businesses. The vast majority of businesses are going to have an interest in search engine optimization and being ranked by Google favorably. But also things like first time to interactive, because it represents basically when the user can start interacting, and therefore the inverse of this is a direct metric of frustration when you're loading a website. So number one was, are you monitoring? Number two is, are you monitoring the right metrics? We're going to move on to the next one. And the next one says, not just, oh, actually, very good, since we have talked about Google, and I apologize for that. We want to make sure people have a second there to tell us if you were even aware that there was a Google update in July, and have you somehow taken measures to incorporate the Google Speed update into your performance strategy, or, as I said, any other strategy that, of course, has to contain performance embedded in it, or otherwise it will not work. So we leave everyone a minute. I can say in the meantime, for us, obviously, as a performance, expert and vendor, we took this to heart, and we basically created a best practice purely based on this. There's a lot of organizations that have reached out to us, basically starting with the Google update, and to tell us if can we help them specifically with the ranking. So the results are in, and I'm very pleased, very surprised in a very positive way. Perhaps our efforts for the last 25 years are starting to bear fruit. So I'm really smiling, and almost half of the attendees took into account the speed update, the Google speed update. So hats off there. And to continue with the presentation, we have to build up. Okay, so now you're monitoring, and then you're monitoring the right metrics. Are you monitoring both real users, and are you using synthetic technology? Now, this is a very important, and I'm going to say a very important point. I'm going to stay a couple seconds here to make the point. When I was at the Bank of New York Mellon, and when I was a customer, I realized there was no way for me to use real user monitoring proactively to prevent issues. However, it's a very important technology from an operational standpoint, and it is a good technology to minimize the duration of outages, for example. So it definitely has a place, and you need both. But without synthetics, there are three things you're missing. Number one, you need a proactive way to detect issues, even in production, before they impact the users. The only way to do that is with users that are synthetic or robotic from all the locations of the world, so that we can detect outages before users come to that area and start the actions. Second, without synthetic, you can run across the life cycle. RUM is not really a good technology to use prior to production. And we're going to talk more about that later, but what it means to do this in pre-production in the release cycle. And then, more important, incorporated here, and this is what if and validations. So this is actually an image I took from Steven Kraska when he was working with an organization to help them actually prior to Black Friday. And what it was is, what if we remove this particular third party? Could we validate that the performance is going to significantly improve? This may justify or not a particular effort to make changes in a website or in an application. So my message is, unfortunately, we still see a lot of people there trying to choose between real user monitoring or synthetic. The truth is you need both, and you need synthetics for proactivity and to prevent issues from happening to begin with. Next slide. Now, this hints at the next item of best practices. And believe it or not, this is extremely uncommon that we see people doing this well. Think about the example that Steven just shared, in which we had this very large file. It wouldn't have been that difficult to capture that prior to production. The problem is either the environments prior to production do not run properly, or these practices of performance are not being incorporated. When I say pre-production, which I had to run for the Bank of New York, it means a lot of things. It means the development cycle, the unit testing. It means the functional testing, the QA testing. It means load testing. Very few people, I can count probably with one hand after the stations, how many people with user front-end side tests to understand user performance while a load test is running, which is only back-end. So basically, we have a message out there saying that more than 80% of delays today are on the front end, and 100% of the load testing industry is ignoring that and testing only on the back end. So message, loud and clear, you have to move this to pre-production, and you have to do the front-end testing and the monitoring and management that we are describing in your entire integrated with your processes. And this builds up to the next point, lesson number 5, which is, okay, I move to pre-production, but I can't just monitor, because that's still going to just confirm a problem. Now, my mindset is all ROI. Where is the return investment? So the return investment of these practices, especially when you move to pre-production, is time to value. You want to be able to release faster than your competitors and innovate. So in pre-production, we don't just monitor. We need to incorporate a technology that allows me to say, okay, here's where you fail, and do these 5 things to get faster or to fix the regression that you incorporated. In other words, you need to minimize the iterations between development and testing, and between testing and production. If we don't minimize those, it's costing us money, and our competitors could have an edge against us. So what is the advice here? Monitoring is not enough. To manage performance, you need an optimization engine, or some people may call it a recommendation engine, which is these guardrails that tests your code against the entire library of anti-patterns, performance anti-patterns. In other words, tell me, for example, the example that we saw of the big JavaScript downloaded, there should have been a system by which the code can be checked against that, and an alert raised, or a red flag, so that you say, this cannot go into production. This file is too big. Cut it up in smaller pieces that can be downloaded simultaneously or multi-threadedly. So this is not that difficult. As I said, I can, however, with one hand, after hundreds of interactions with organizations that are doing this. Don't forget, this is our business. This is what we do for a living. Basically identify what people can do to get fast. And what we get consistently is that they had not thought of having this system. At best, they had a way to confirm through monitoring that a regression was injected. So there's no ROI if you don't have an optimization engine. And this is applicable, obviously, in production too. And to make it more powerful, we should make sure that these get embedded in your process. there shouldn't have to be any manual work. If you integrate into your continuous integration, continuous development workflows into your release cycle, and if an event will trigger, it will be checked against this guardrail, and you will get immediate confirmation of what you need to do. This is a very important lesson, and all through my career, way before I had this current role here, I always attempted to enhance what people call monitoring with actionable information that you can take into action and basically get faster. So with that, we're going to go to the next slide, and I'm going to pass it on to Stephen to show us another example of how this came into play.
Yeah, thank you, Francis. And I think this example that we're going to talk about here briefly is a really good example of kind of all of those sort of good ideas rolled into one. And whereas some of the other examples that we provided so far as fumbles, we didn't have a direct working relationship with those groups. We could simply monitor their particular key pages for the holiday because we're a synthetic platform that can go anywhere. So we were able to do that. But this is a group that we actually work directly with. So I know a lot about what they were doing. And one of the things that they were doing, to speak back, I told you that there was going to be a second half of the single page app story, and this is kind of where that begins. They were looking at rolling to a single page app for the holidays because of some UX features that they were looking for, UI changes, and just generally making a more performant website. But they followed what I would really say would be, again, all of those best practices of one for all the folks who said that they started at least 6 months or more before the holiday and planning for it. That's what they did. For them, the holiday is their biggest season, like it is, I'm sure, for many of you. And so they began well in advance, and their testing they actually did on production or very nearly production environments. If it wasn't one that was necessarily served directly to customers, it was running on the same architecture, which allowed us to really test for everything from the top down to make sure that the CDN was performing as expected in the remote locations, to make sure that all the other resources that we needed were doing the things that we anticipated. And when it comes directly back to that issue of kind of either globbing all the JavaScript together or following the more modern practice that takes advantage of HTTP2 and the multiplexing, it's really the exact opposite story, where the example you saw earlier was a 10 megabyte file which contained pretty much all of the page's JavaScript. This brand had taken that and broken it up into pieces that were much more manageable by the browser. And the impact of it is what you see below here. So the interactive time of that other website, that slower architecture from the same location compared to this other brand it's cut in half. And the Google recommendation for those who may not be familiar with it is that interactive time should be less than 5 seconds. So you can see here what an impact it makes to kind of do these things correctly. And going forward, just to provide an example and a little bit of like substantive proof about what this looks like, here's the 2 pages. So again, on the left is that brand with the 10 megabyte JavaScript file. You can see that there were another 2 megs tucked away in there. Presumably, that's actually third-party JavaScript. But you see there were 63 requests for it. Now, the old school method would tell you that the 106 requests that you see on the right, the old school method would say that that's no longer the way to be. You'd want to be with fewer request counts. But in reality, because these files are, 1, broken up and easier to parse by the browser, 2, they take advantage of the HTTP2 multiplexing capability rather than being threaded to download all at once. We actually see significant performance gains there. And again, the real story behind this is not so much the tactical change that they made, whether the JavaScript was 1 file or 100, but really it was the fact that this was all tested and vetted well before the holidays. I know for a fact that this was all ready to go, sealed up, and perfected by October. And by the time that November came around and Black Friday, this had already been done and in place for several weeks, and they knew that they were going to be just fine, and that's exactly the case.
Excellent. Thank you very much. And 2 things I love about that story is this concept of doing early means not just doing it early in the life cycle as we advocate, but also, to be honest, people have to do this early enough from a time frame standpoint, and that's a very good lesson. The other thing is the example you had there of first time to interactive of 7.9 seconds, almost 8 seconds. If you think about in Black Friday, someone trying to get interactivity on a page, taking 8 seconds, the revenue impact of something like that is tremendous. And those organizations probably measuring with their analytics have understood very well the dip they took, even from a bottom line standpoint, by not managing this, number one, early enough, and number two, of course, understanding all these best practices, and something as the guardrail of, is this file too big? So moving on, this third party is actually one of the most common. I know, go back, please. It's actually one of the most common. And what I want to say about this is that at least 50% of the cases that Steven and I work on have it's either mostly about managing the third party or a significant part of that. And what I think a lot of the missed opportunity is that there's a sense of accountability that goes away when you're using a third party. And it's not just a tag, but also if you have a platform, or we're talking about the cloud, or even imagine an e-commerce platform, as many organizations we work with are doing, there's a sense of diffusing accountability. And the truth is, if it's my website and it's my money and it's my business and it's my livelihood, I take ownership. And that means, what do I use as insurance policy to hold my third parties as to their SLAs, or to objectively show them that they need to do something to improve performance? And this is both a platform and a tag. It doesn't matter to me. The message is actually that if you're using third parties, which obviously is universal, all the more reason to have your own process by which you own the management. And I call it now management, because through these lessons we've learned to move on from just monitoring, management of performance. So the lesson is, own it. Third party is not an excuse. If anything, makes it much more meaningful. And to that, we have another example to share with you all. So next slide.
Yeah, thank you, Francis. And it's a really good example to talk to sort of that the strategy of monitoring a early production version that's as similar as possible to the one that customers will actually be getting. So if you are just trying to monitor and test from a site that has only your code on it in order to make decisions about how it's performing as you're making a replatforming decision or some other update, you'll miss out on something like this, which is actually what someone caught and was able to actually take action on. So another group that we were working with was looking into the spikes that they would see in performance. We had set very clear budgets for them. Budgets, actually, as you referenced earlier, the Google metrics, Google has preferences for fast, slow, and average, everything in between. We had set performance budgets for them based on those metrics. And as we were watching those metrics, we would occasionally get alerts that something had been violated. When we dug into that violation, what we saw was a rogue third party. In fact, when we brought up the name of it, this user said to us, no, we removed that from our sites 3 months ago, or some timeline like that. And when he actually saw the data, it was very clear that no, it hadn't been removed, and for whatever reason had been causing the latency that it was seeing. So the important thing there was really, again, taking this to that environment that's as similar as possible to the one that your end users are seeing before it actually gets to your end users. And that's exactly where this was. They had caught this in their staging environment, and their staging environment directly matched the production environment in almost every way, which is why they were able to catch this before it went out, or before major impact had been made. And so really what we're getting at here is, had they only been watching their own code, they never would have caught this error. And had they never caught this error, there would have been a significant impact for the end user. But we managed to get ahead of that by tracking third party and holding them accountable.
Thank you very much for that. And we're going to move on to this, which is one of my favorite lessons. And I firmly believe, based on my experience, and as I said, a life and entire career based on performance, both on the customer side and the vendor side, that there is too much of an understanding that performance is ownership. As I said, our CTO loves to say that it's not paint. something that you just put on top of a finalized product, that you have to build that product with performance in mind. But there's something else even that I love to say. Performance is expertise. Without the expertise aspect, it's not going to work and it's not going to have all these results. And expertise has to be built through that ownership. So honestly, I blame vendors, but I also blame the final organization, the customer organizations, the client organizations, because there's a little bit too much of a belief that an investment in a quote unquote tool and some couple days of deployment is going to magically manage performance for you. Nobody's going to manage performance for you, but if you have the right platform integrated, then work with that vendor towards a common goal. And the common goal, the industry should now learn, the common goal is not, hey, my product is deployed. But the common goal is, can I come down 3 seconds? And can I correlate that to my business metrics, such as my conversions? And that is success. And hopefully if the vendor helps you do that, this is my entire life mission and why I came back to the vendor side after my experience as a customer to quote unquote do it well. If the vendor is willing to sit with you, roll up their sleeves, and work towards those goals while they teach you how to use that platform to that is a tremendously valuable experience. You take ownership, the vendor helps you, you become faster, and you get this embedded in your processes so that now it becomes part of the culture. And to be honest, I take a step back to say what we have seen as the single most successful initiative that any of the organizations I've worked with for my entire career, to be honest, not just recently, is when the champions attempt to and try really hard to build a culture in which performance is something that goes on from the very beginning, and that you need to take ownership and create that expertise and hold vendors accountable to results. I think the time has passed to give you software, drop it on you, and now it's up to you. Let's achieve results together. And there's nothing more validating for a platform than being the right platform to achieve results and correlate them to the business metrics. We have a lot of examples of this. I don't necessarily think this is the right platform right now, but we have probably future webinars to go more in detail. But yes, there are many examples in which we have done this and have tremendous results correlating and increasing performance through our efforts, through applying these guardrails to the bottom line of the business. And this helps everybody because then organizations don't have to worry about validating these efforts. So we have one more story to be a good example of how vendors and organizations can collaborate towards common goals in performance. Stephen?
Yeah, thank you, Francis. Oh, we have a poll first.
Sorry about that. I muted myself by mistake. So talking about this and this specific point of tracking performance in the sense of how it impacts the bottom line, whether it be conversion or revenue, I'm really curious to know how many of our attendees work in organizations where this is being done. Is performance just something more technical, or is there a clear correlation on top of the C-levels to specify that there is a direct correlation between performance and the bottom line, conversions and revenue? And again, I'm crossing fingers because I've seen such good results and an increasing maturity in the market through the various polls that we've had, that now I'm feeling optimistic about these results. Let's see what we get. It's actually my favorite topic, which is when we put performance and the rubber meets the road and we understand what it's doing to our business. And I think this validates our desire to increase the best practices, whether platform and expertise or both. And again, excellent results. I love that 56%. I take my hat off to the people that joined because I believe they probably are in the upper section from a maturity standpoint. So really pleased to see that. And, still the 33% that don't do that. We really are eager to help organizations achieve that correlation. That correlation is the bottom line of all our efforts. We're going to move on to an example that we saw from the holidays on this particular topic of ownership and reliance on partnership with vendors.
Yeah, thank you, Francis. And this is a really interesting one. And I will say right away that we took liberty with the word holiday here, but I think everyone will understand what we mean when we get to it. So this is a telecom company. And while our good friends in the e-commerce world may have one or two events a year that are as big as Black Friday, a telecom company can have a day like that as many times as Apple chooses that they have that day, right? Anytime Apple or Google or Samsung drops a new product, it's basically a Black Friday for these folks. And so they were aware of at least one of these that was coming up. Some of them, they don't even get that much notice, but there was a general perception that the performance practice needed to get better. For example, one thing that would happen in the past is they would take whatever images they were provided by one of these vendors, say Apple, for example, for a new iPhone, and that would just be whatever made it to the page. There would be no real looking at it from a web performance standpoint. And so that's one thing that absolutely changed on their part. They really put in a process to vet these images, not just accept them at face value, but vet these images and these resources that they were given from their vendors that they have to sell on their page, and improving them to their own standards, right? So that able to reduce the page weight, and then the timing, getting it early in the year, early in the process. Again, they're following the same best practices of they're validating these before they go out to customers as clandestinely as they can. I know that they're monitoring the pages for new devices before that device ever hits the stage, and but also for early in the year, they're tracking this proactively. Like I said, that event could happen for them at any time of Apple's choosing, and so they have to be ready. So early in the year for them means all the time, and they have to do that. And then naturally, because the device they're selling is probably the device that people are accessing it on, they have to be prepared from that in a perspective that's ready for those mobile applications. And so they've really taken a strategy to heart of not doing the dichotomy is breaking down these days, but you really still see some people who are not quite in the mobile first perspective, but they've really gotten to that point. But there used to be that a strong dichotomy in the world of you have a mobile site and you have a desktop site, and they certainly are breaking down those barriers and again trying to optimize really that content for the users themselves that they're seeing. And again, speaking to what you said earlier, Francis, about the value of RUM and synthetic being side by side, or RUM and the laboratory environment being side by side even, that's how they find out that most people who are going to XYZ page are on the device. It may seem like a no-brainer, but they have to be able to validate that, to your point about the business metric. They have to say, most of our users are in fact doing it this way, so we need to optimize for that user. How do we test for that user? We can create a laboratory environment in order to do that and prove out that this is the right way to go, and then see the results kind of circle back in that same RUM platform. So it's a really good strategy all around that they've adopted to kind of solving for the perennial Black Friday as they have.
Excellent. Thank you very much. And just to emphasize another lesson learned from that example, if you don't mind, go back to that slide, is the following aspect. How many times, and I hope we have in the audience people that can relate to this, but I also hope not too many because it's not a good experience. We invest in vendors, but at the end, they end up on the shelves and they don't really produce all the result they wanted. Here we have an organization that understood they needed help, and in collaboration, in this case with us, and through the right guardrails and the combination of monitoring and optimization engine, halved their response times in barely a month and a half. Now, I urge everyone in the industry who has invested in quote-unquote performance vendors, and that those investments have sat there not producing any ROI, to think about the impact of quote-unquote doing things well. For a company like this, massive, to come to a vendor and understand they needed help, and in less than 2 months have an ROI that blew everyone's expectations away. This is something that the industry is not very used to seeing. This is our passion to do, and that's what we're sharing with everyone. Next slide. We have our last goal to understand if there's other initiatives that are taken on this year or were part of the 2018 theme. And it's, to me, very interesting because if you follow previous years. There's a tendency for the cloud to be up or down. Some vendors, some organizations started to take mobile performance more seriously, as Stephen was describing, or the use of CDNs, for example. So we'll wait for everybody to send their responses and comment on this, but it's really something that teaches us a lot, because if you think about it, as I said earlier, embedded in any of these initiatives is performance. We're not calling these performance initiatives, but if performance was to be downgraded, who that owns, say, a VP of user experience or digital, or even a CIO, who would, quote unquote, bless any of these initiatives if it didn't ensure that performance is at a minimum maintained, if not improved? Therefore, performance is always the initiative, no matter how you call it. And this is why I'm in performance. So not surprising, interesting to see the cloud taking a big chunk of it. Replatforming, we see a lot of that. I assume everybody's already using a CDN. And I like seeing that mobile first, because it means that there is an awareness of performance for mobile and what it means. And hats off to those that are implementing HTTP2 and moving on with time. So let's move on to the next slide. We're going to do a quick recap of what we've said so that everybody can get an actionable nugget to work with today. So let's move to the list. Next slide. And so what we said is, number one, you cannot improve what you cannot track. So start monitoring. You need a technology that is tracking performance from the user standpoint. This is way above and beyond server side. This is from the user standpoint. Make sure that you track user experience, lesson 2, which means the metrics that correlate the most to user. And what is that? First time to interactive, and also first contentful paint if we care about Google ranking. Then we are using real user monitoring from an operational standpoint, but you need synthetic technology. A synthetic technology because it's proactive, because you can embed it through the life cycle, and because you can do hypotheses and validations, and that is fundamental when you're taking this seriously. And those wins that Stephen was sharing with us prove that. And then the next point is go early. Early means time, but also means in the release cycle. Go early to your development. Go early to your QA. Go early to your load testing, which, as I said, the entire world is ignoring, and from the user standpoint, and go early to your staging. And then monitoring is not enough. You need an optimization engine. This is when performance becomes management. If you're not on level 5, you're not doing management. You're doing monitoring only, which is important, but not enough. Use an engine that tells you, that checks against the guardrails for performance and tells you what to do to become faster and to stay fast, and embed that in your entire life cycle all the way through production. Then the 6th point, your third parties. You have to take ownership, and you have to have a way to provide objective information, not just in a point in time, but over time, to third-party companies, so that you keep them honest, so that you hold them to their SLAs, and you have objective information to management. That's your insurance. You wouldn't go to the road without insurance. And lesson 7 is enough with the myth that performance is magic. It's not paint. It doesn't matter how much you invest. If you want ROI, take ownership and engage with vendors that understand this, that have expertise, and that are willing to put that expertise to serve your goals. And remember, your goal is never deploy a tool. Your goal is to become faster than your competitors, so you have an edge and more conversions and more revenue. We're going to move to the next slide. And brief message from our sponsors, sponsor Rigor. So we have really honored to offer you a platform, but also a solution that consists of expertise to help you with these initiatives. Remember, our passion is really performance. Performance from the user standpoint, and performance that's not just this thumbs up, thumbs down, you're doing it well, but performance that tells you with the world's largest library of performance anti-patterns what to do to become faster. We really wanted to come here and not mention this until the end, because the message is we're learning together to manage performance, and I have a passion to share this with the entire market. But yes, it would be really interesting for everyone to find help from a platform standpoint, but also expertise standpoint. And if you go to the next slide, we have an interesting proposition. We have learned that this lesson of the optimization engine is probably the one that's one of the ones that's really the least widespread. Almost everybody doesn't really have a thorough way to check against guardrails. So we're making this available for free so that you can understand how different it can be when you start getting very actionable information, very similar to the one that we've been sharing with the quote-unquote winners of the holiday that took some of these early enough and started to take action and bring the response time down. So I encourage everyone to go to that URL that you see at the bottom left. These slides are going to be also shared, and you will be able to click on that button and get your report, start working and managing for free, because it's our passion. We're basically trying to heal a broken industry that relies too much on tools, not expertise, and on tools that just confirm problems instead of helping you get faster. And we don't want that. So try that, please. And on to the next one, which is where everybody has a chance to ask some meaningful questions. And we're going to wait a second there and see some questions. And Stephen, if you don't mind, I'll ask you some of these questions and we can give our perspective. Okay, so one question that comes is, somebody says, what should be the goal when it comes to performance optimization? And this is a very good question, and I'm glad it came up, which is, what's my goal? How fast is fast enough? Stephen, what's your perspective on this?
Yeah, that's one of my favorite questions to get because it's so relative. So there's really strict sort of numbers that like Google has put out. I mentioned one earlier, right? They say that from a particular connection type and state and all these other things, that 5 seconds is a good time for time to first interactive, and that they have other metrics around first contentful paint. Like I said, they have a thing that anything faster than 1 second is considered fast. But really, and those are great goals to keep in mind always. But the other thing we're saying is, faster than your competitors is really the answer. And the other one would be fast enough that you see an impact in those business goals, right? I think it was, I forget the name of the researcher who published this, but it was basically they found, there was a certain threshold at which a performance metric actually, made an improvement in the business metric when it improved by a certain percentage. And really being able to track and correlate those two things very closely is important. So from a hard answers, there's some out there that are provided, by Google based on what they think, which are good, basic starting points if you want that very deliberate answer. But the true answer for me is, I would say it'd be at least 20% faster than your fastest competitor. And then B, you need to move the metrics, the performance metrics that are going to move your business metrics along with it. There's no kind of one right answer for everybody, but there is a good starting point.
I love it. Thank you very much. And to be honest, this question is so important. I'm going to make the 8th a piece of advice for our audience, which is, don't just measure yourself, measure your competitors. Because to be honest, your goal should just be to be faster than them. And there has to be a way. You need to have technology that allows you to visualize that. If you end up going into a holiday like Black Friday, having come up in that list and being on top of your competitors, no matter what the absolute number is, you have won. And that is the measure of success. And based on time also, and with that, I'm going to pass it on back to Mick.
All right, thank you. And thank you all for joining us today. A very special thank you to Francis and Stephen for sharing their insights today. Feel free to contact any of us with any additional questions that you may have. A final few reminders. Within a day or so, we will email everyone who registered for today's webcast a link to download the slides and the recording. Also, if you found today's presentation insightful, don't forget to subscribe to the Rigor blog for industry trends and more best practices. And check out our free web performance report to look at the current health of your website and get a little glimpse of what Rigor can offer you. Thanks again for attending, everyone. Have a wonderful day.